So first off, thanks to Poets and Writers for hosting this conversation. Thanks to CBC for selling the book. Thanks to all of you who are tuning in, watching. I am so honored to be here, Clint. I just, full disclosure, when just before we had our first interview, I had procrastinated on reading the book. So it was a couple of days before the interview, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be brutal. I've got to read like, a 200-page plus history book in like 2 days. But it was so not what I expected. Like once I started reading, I was like, oh, this is going to be easy. Like it was just really a wonderful book to read. It was wonderful talking with you, and I'm really excited about tonight. So I'm going to get into my questions. My first question is just one out of sheer curiosity as a fellow writer. Like, what has the past 6 weeks been like for you? With the publication of this book and its reception, being a #1 New York Times bestseller, what has it been like?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the kind words and for the really beautiful and generous profile. It really means a lot. And so the past 6 weeks, I've been telling people that it's like when a dog sticks their head out of the window of a moving car. It's like exhilarating. It is overwhelming. It's like sensory overload. Um, but you're so excited, and then you pull your head back in, and you're like, "That was amazing." Also, I'm dehydrated. Um, so I've been like a dog with my head out of the window of a car, and it's been more than I could have ever imagined. I wrote a book about that in some ways I like had thought of as being the subject of my dissertation. I ended up writing a dissertation. You hear my children in the background. It is, as I said, it's bedtime now. So um, they are part of what I was doing was like, for my dissertation, I explored the relationship between education and incarceration. And for this book, I was exploring public history and its relationship to slavery and historical sites. And I could have done it either way, right? I could have made a decision to write the dissertation as a sort of narrative nonfiction book and made the decision to write this as my dissertation. But I'm glad it worked out the way that it did. Um, and and I mean, I guess it's hard to explain how like this was not something I anticipated in any way. When my agent and editor called at 5:30 on Wednesday, the Wednesday after it came out, which is when the New York Times bestseller list comes out. Um, I, they told me like they were like it's number one, and I just was like, I fell out of my chair. I never imagined that the reception would be the way that it is, but I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful to the people who have read it. I'm so grateful for the generous reviews. I'm so grateful for um, people who have recommended it and shared it. It's been unreal. I mean, obviously, the asterisk, so to speak, is that I haven't had a book tour in the traditional sense. I've largely been, as I said, sort of sitting here. This is my video spot, and then over there I have like a fancy microphone that I bought, and that's my audio interview spot. And if you have NPR, you probably heard me on some program over there. So I feel, just endless gratitude, and still, it's still a sort of surreal experience. My publisher sent me a frame of the New York Times bestseller list from the week that I came out and was #1. And sometimes I look at it, I'm like, who is that? Like, who's that for? Is that for me? And I'm just reminded of it. And they're having a hard time today. Yeah, no, I feel just grateful. And as much as they don't want to go to bed, it's been very cool to like be able to come home to, not even come home, just like open the door and be with my kids. Like a long month-long book tour on the road would have been hard with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. But yeah, it's a long way of saying it's been amazing. It's been bananas. It's been just I feel very full and just very grateful.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm glad you mentioned like being on NPR, because my next question is actually in reference to the interview you did with Terry Gross. And you said something really important about the efforts that Monticello is making to educate visitors about the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and the Hemings family, but Sally Hemings in particular, and trying to talk about that relationship in the context of like non-consensuality. And in the interview, you said, I think that there's a conversation about the subjugation of Black women's bodies during slavery and that the sexual exploitation of Black women that we haven't like quite like really broached yet.
Mm.
And so my question for you is, what are your thoughts about that conversation? Like, what should we be talking about? Where should it be headed?
Yeah, I mean, part of what I've been thinking a lot about is the way that our sort of, to the extent that we have a public consciousness around slavery and what it was, it's often a very gendered one, right? Like it's often one that is shaped by sort of masculinist conceptions of what enslavement was. Like it's like men being beaten or men in fields or it just is it is just gendered in a way that is not necessarily reflective of the totality of the experience of many people. And I think part of what has happened for me, and specifically going to the Whitney plantation in Louisiana, which for people who might not be familiar is one of the only plantations in the country, the only plantation in Louisiana and one of the only plantations in the country where that centers the lives of enslaved people, and centers the curatorial experience of that plantation on a recognition that that plantation is a site of intergenerational torture and exploitation. It is surrounded by a constellation of plantations where people continue to hold weddings, and where I talked to wedding planners who said that sometimes people use the former slave cabins as bridal suites for their ceremonies. And so, obviously, a sort of profound and sort of violent ahistoricism that is happening in these plantations that surround the Whitney. And the Whitney looks around and is like, nah, that's not what a plantation should be doing. A plantation should, as a museum, a plantation should recognize that this is a site of torture, but also at the same time lift up the humanity of the people who were subjected to that torture. And one of the things that they do there is focus specifically on the lives of women and children, not singularly, but like really put a heavy focus so that you have to sit with this sort of insidiousness of the violence that Black women were subjected to, the insidiousness of what it meant for thousands of Black children to die in infancy. Um, and and I think that one of the things that I think often about, or the sort of messages around slavery that I've been inundated with growing up, were often around the sort of physical violence and the sort of spectacle of cruelty that was embodied within the institution of slavery, the beatings and the whippings. The famous picture of the man with the sort of spider web of scars running down his back, the image in Roots where Kunta Kinte is beaten and refuses to for so long say the name that his enslaver has given him. These are sort of famous scenes in our understanding of slavery and reflect the brutality, and I understand why. But something I realized as I was writing this book that I hadn't thought as much about was family separation. And I'm not sure why I didn't think about it as much, but I think having a family while I was writing this book, being a new father, a new husband, I had these moments where I sat back and I was like, what would it be like if I were in my home and then one day I woke up and my children were gone and had been disappeared into the night, and I had no idea where they were, and I had no idea if I would ever see them again. And then you realize that that is the sort of omnipresent threat that loomed over millions of enslaved people across generations, every day of their lives. The threat that at any moment, any night, any day, they could be separated from the people they love most. They could be separated from their husband, their wife, their children, their parents, their community. And when you really just sit with it, right? Like when I look at my 4-year-old, when I look at my 2-year-old, when I look at my wife, and I think about what it would mean to be separate. I can't even almost like bring myself to like fully conceptualize it because it's so horrific to imagine. But again, that is one element of what enslaved people lived through every day. And it was utilized and wielded as a mechanism of psychological torture and terror, to prevent Black people from running away, because of what they've said, what they an enslaver says they might do to your family or your community, the people you love. Um, and it was sort of like just wielded over them at every point. And so a place like the Whitney, I think, does a really good job in making that intimate, and making that reality intimate, in terms of one's relationship to family, and in terms of their relationship, how we think about women in slavery, in presenting us with the testimonies of formerly enslaved women, and people whose mothers were formerly enslaved, and in using the Federal Writers Project, sort of New Deal era project that collected thousands of stories of enslaved people in the late 1930s, to show what the sort of another omnipresent threat that hung over Black women and enslaved women was the omnipresent threat of sexual violence, that your body did not belong to you, that you could be subjected, and you were subject to the whims of your enslaver, and had no uh, means by which to push back against what they would attempt to do to you. And that was, again, like what a countless amount of enslaved women lived through, in ways that clearly scholars have written about for a long time, but I think in ways that collectively as a country, people don't often sit with.
I agree. Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think that it really influences the conversations we have today about sexual violence happening right now, particularly against Black women, against Black trans women. They're just that our histories of not having these conversations is now coming to bear on the present moment. So yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, I wanted to talk to you. So we had a really good conversation during our initial interview about Blandford Cemetery, and about like how hard it would have been for me to sit in that space and also to collect the narratives of the people in that space. Um, but I also wanted to ask you about Goree Island, and about the House of Slaves and the Door of No Return. And you do something really interesting in that chapter. And I think it actually ties in. I think that what you kind of model is something that I wish could be modeled in difficult historical conversations, like the subjugation of Black women's bodies in enslavement. But you do this really beautiful thing where you have this sort of triangulation of, the story that Goree Island tells about itself, and then the historical record, and then also the real importance of both of those things, right? And I think it would have been really easy to kind of flatten that chapter, right? And to sort of not include these historical records that in some ways kind of contradict the story that is being told about Goree Island, right? But you don't, and you include all of those things in that one chapter. And I really just wanted to ask about the decision to do that. Like how did you come to that conclusion? What did you feel about it? Was it a difficult decision to make? Anything about that would be great.
Yeah, it was interesting, because I went to Goree Island when I studied abroad in Senegal in 2009. So it would have been a decade before my visit. Um, and you know, it was interesting because upon when I decided to go to Goree, I was not cognizant of the fact that the story I was told about millions of people being sent from Goree Island to the New World, um, was not necessarily empirically true, right? Like I went with the intention of going to a place where I thought millions of people was the last place millions of people were held before they were sent across the Atlantic, to the New World. And in preparing for the trip there, realized that it was not millions of people who were sent from Goree Island. It was maybe 30,000. And that was an interesting way to sort of enter the space, because I wanted to think about what it meant that I'd been told this story, that is grounded that might not be sort of factually accurate, but is grounded in a sort of larger truth, and part of a larger history of narratives that are meant to convey the horror of what slavery was. And I think, I've talked to a couple of historians, who I think were really helpful in thinking through that, because I think it could be very easy to go and be like, they're lying, they're not telling the truth, they're being hyperbolic, in ways that are dishonest. And I think there's a difference between the sort of between dishonesty and attempting to tell a story when you have to fill in so many of the gaps of that story yourself, right? Like we don't have, and for a long time did not have, records of how many people specifically were sent from Goree Island. And so this is a story that has been told since the mid 1950s, about this place, when we were entering a period in which slavery was more, after the civil rights movement, more fully entering the American public consciousness, and after the sort of independence of a lot of these West African nations following their them being subjected to colonialism from various European countries. All of West Africa and the United States were in these sort of parallel journeys of trying to fill in the gaps of so much of what they had been subjected to by colonialism and empire and slavery. And I think part of what I wanted to do was just, as I try to do in every place that I go, is approach it with a level of grace, and generosity, and also humility, right? Like, who am I to say, to go into this place that I've only been to once before, where I'm not a part of the culture, where I'm not a part of I'm not part of that nation. I don't suffer, or I won't experience any of these sort of repercussions or implications of any sort of um, correctives that I'm attempting to make. I think you can ultimately, Goree Island is a symbol of something that happened across the western coast of Africa, and they are still in the process, in the same way Monticello is still in the process, in the same way that other plantations in the United States are in the process of learning more information and re-examining and recalibrating the way that they tell the story. And simply because they have used a number that was incorrect for a long time doesn't mean that the place in and of itself doesn't have historical value, or doesn't have symbolic value, and doesn't have meaning. Like, as the director of the site said when I was there, he was like, one slave is too many, right? Like, and so we shouldn't get too caught up in sort of whether it was like 5 million or 30,000 or something in between, because 30,000 is still a lot of people. That is a lot of people. And if we think of the House of Slaves on Goree Island as a microcosm for a phenomenon that was happening again across the western coast of Africa, then I think we put less pressure on Goree Island to be this sort of singular space, or singular symbol of, or a place that in and of itself represents a much larger phenomenon, and say that this is a piece of a larger puzzle that in many ways we are still collectively putting together.
I agree. Yeah, thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit more about process. Like, we talked about how this book, it came out of what you thought would be a second collection of poetry and turned into something else. But I'd love to know how writing this book has changed your relationship to poetry, right? Like, particularly dealing with like facts, dealing with historical records, incorporating them in your work. Do you feel like any of that has had an influence on how you are writing poems, how you will be writing poems?
That's a great question. I mean, writing this book changed me as a writer a lot. I think I became a journalist as I was writing this book. I was. It's been fun. It's been funny. I think we might have talked about this before, but like, the first line of every description or biography or review says like poet and journalist Clint Smith. And for a long time, and still in some ways, I'm like, who's a journalist? I'm like, who's that? Because I'm a staff writer at the Atlantic now, but I've been at the Atlantic for less than a year. I started last September, and so I finished by the time I started working at the Atlantic, the book was mostly done. Um, and but I didn't. Part of what I realized is that this book, as I said to you during our interview, it couldn't just be my own reflections and meditations on my trips to these places. It had to be in conversation with with the way that other people were experiencing these places. I had to have conversations with the tour guides. I had to have conversations with the other visitors on on these tours. I had to have conversations with people who had directly experienced um, what these places represented, right? So that's why when I go to Angola, that chapter wouldn't be what it was unless I was with Norris Henderson, who himself was like incarcerated at Angola for almost 30 years. When I go to Monticello wouldn't be what it is if I hadn't gone up to Donna and Grace, who had their understanding of Jefferson completely sort of decimated, who came to Monticello and had no idea that Jefferson was an enslaver, and had no idea that Monticello was a plantation. I think that opened up a whole different set of questions and possibilities to explore in that chapter that wouldn't have been there otherwise. If I, going to Goree Island and not trying to have conversations with the director of the site, or not trying to have conversations with students in West Africa and Senegal, thinking about how they're taught about the history of slavery and putting that in conversation with how students in the United States are taught. I went and did this journalistic work that I didn't necessarily call journalistic at the time, but it was reporting. It was conversations that I think made the book a lot richer than it would have been, and a lot more dynamic and sort of textured. And in terms of my relationship to poetry, I've not written a lot of poems lately. I miss them. Um, and I will be curious to see if my relationship to writing poems has changed since working on this book. I mean, poetry is all over this book. But I know that, this book is, um, what poetry has done is poetry taught me how to pay attention. Poetry taught me to focus on the granular, to focus on the microscopic, to pay attention to the most minute of detail and lift that up and excavate it and explore it. And it gave me a better way to think about like sensory detail and what something smells like or looks like or tastes like or feels like. Um, and that I think I tried to put all over the text. I wanted to pay very close attention to what people look like. I wanted to pay very close attention to what the weather was like at each place. I wanted to pay very close attention to what the wind was, how the wind was moving, the sounds the ground was making, the way that the air smelled. Just all of it to create an almost sort of cinematic experience for the reader, because I really wanted them to feel like they were on this journey alongside me. And the writers that I admire the most in this world, that we are, especially as Black writers, a part of a tradition and lineage of, have always rejected the sort of um, notion that one should be constrained to a singular genre or a singular medium. It's Langston Hughes is known mostly for his poems, but he would have told you that he was mostly a novelist, right? Or like he would have, or an essay. I mean, Du Bois, essays, novels, poems, or Neil Hurston, plays, novels, essays. I mean, just we are part of a tradition in African American studies and Black studies that, in and of itself, says like there's no one discipline, there's no one genre that can capture the nature of our experience in this country, and we have to use all of the tools we can to capture that the various dynamics of our experience. And so, I love experimenting with different genres. And my first book was a collection of poems. This book was a narrative nonfiction book. You might have to teach me how to write a novel. So
I'm still learning, I feel like. Yeah. I love what you said about like that the nature of our experience is so expansive, because often when people ask me the question like, well, how do you know which genre, like what goes into which genre? And sometimes it doesn't feel that sort of cut and dry, like it is going into the 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 wonder and the messiness of being human, but also being a black person in this country, for me being a black woman,
Mm,
and the forms that, you know, the content leads you to the form.
mm.
Yeah,
And I
so
think too, we're seeing so many books now, I think too, from Black writers who are like writing almost sort of hybrid text. I mean, we always have, right? Like, I mean, you know,
mhm.
think about Jean Toomer was doing this, you know, back in the day. You know,
Yeah.
that book is like, I remember reading it and being like, is this a poetry collection? I was
Mhm.
confused, you know. So, um, you know, some people write poems and call it a novel. Some people write, you know, uh,
I've been accused of writing novels and calling them poems.
you know, I mean, but like, what is a poem? What is a novel? Like, what is I mean, you know, there's sometimes these demarcations can be helpful in serving as guideposts.
Mm,
But I think when the demarcation of genre stops being a guidepost and starts being a sort of thing that limits you or
mm,
that limits the possibilities of your imagination, then I think it's doing a disservice to the work, right? Like many of these genres are just created in order to help the publishing industry sell books, right? Like I just read, what is this book? I wish it was, is it here? I just read this book by Ayad Akhtar. We have the same publisher at Little Brown, called Homeland. It's over there. Homeland Elegies, and it's a novel, but it's also like very clearly a collection of like personal, largely autobiographical essays. But you know, if you want to render it some of the facts of what happened fiction. I mean, if you want to make something fictional that was a fact, then you should call it a novel, not a memoir. And like, but again, the all of these lines are so blurry, and I think we shouldn't get caught up in naming, you know, in being stuck in a specific literary lane, and
mhm.
more of like, well, what is your imagination telling you the text should do, and what is the subject matter asking of you? You know, this book began as some poems and then turned into like a short essay and then turned into a longer chapter and then turned into this sort of travel log. And you know, I think sometimes it shifts and evolves as you are putting it together.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the work is always smarter than I am, I think, and sort of knows when to turn, when to shift, when to, yeah, when to transform. Absolutely. What's exciting you right now about your work? I know you've been incredibly busy, and I'm not going to ask the question everyone asks, which is like, what's next? But what I really want to know is what is inspiring you right now? What is exciting you right now about your writing life?
I honestly, I love that I work at a place that allows me to write across a range of different subjects. And so I
Yes.
was on leave from the Atlantic for a month as I was doing book media and book tour stuff. And I recently started back again. And the first piece I wrote was about the European Soccer Championships, Euro
Mhm.
2020. They call it Euro 2020 because it was supposed to happen last year, but because of the pandemic, it got postponed. Um, but like, I played soccer my whole life and I love soccer. And I, you know, from age 4 to 17, I thought I was going to be a professional soccer player. Um, and it didn't work out that way. Here I am. I'm a writer, which is a great job. You know, I love being a writer. And it's funny because when I think I posted this, I was like, when I was a kid, I wanted to be on the cover of magazines as a soccer star, and then now I'm on the cover of Poets and Writers magazine as a writer. So, you know, Poets and Writers magazine is better than Sports Illustrated anyway. Um,
Great.
but I love the game, and I love now that I can write about it. I just was working on a piece today about the sort of nature of the English national team and how they all have all these different players who are immigrants or their parents are immigrants from different West African or West Indian nations, and how that has transformed the team and the nation's understanding of the team, and it's a sort of symbol for where the, you know, the tension between Brexit and inclusiveness. And um, I love, you know, I wrote a book about slavery, and how slavery is memorialized and reckoned with. But I also love that I, get to write about the sort of um, nature of fandom in global football, and write about my journey as a you know growing up as a soccer player, and um, yeah. So I like right now that I'm writing about soccer because that feels fun and is a sort of pivot away from the some of the heaviness that I've been you know discussing over the past 6 weeks or so.
Yeah, I think that's really important to like diversify the diversify the work. I've been writing recently a lot about joy, which is just kind of fun, and
Mm.
love. Yeah, yeah. And there, I've been writing terrible poems, which I like you. Prose is exhausting and it takes a lot out of me. And I wasn't really writing poetry while I was writing my novel, but
Mm.
I'm coming back to it. And the poems are terrible, and I love them. And I'm like
You
super
have to write
excited about.
terrible ones to get to the good ones.
Exactly, exactly. I'm like, yes, it's coming back. Like it's
Yes,
bad, but it's back.
yes, yes.
And yeah, and I'm gonna work on it and it's gonna get better. So yeah, I feel you on that. Definitely. So let's shift into some of the audience Q&A. And the first question is, what role do you think historical sites play in telling the full and honest stories of history? Is access to the tangible environments necessary?
Hmm. It's an interesting question. Is it necessary?
Yeah.
I don't know that it's necessary. I mean, I wouldn't want to suggest that like one has to visit a historical site in order to understand the brutality and nature of slavery. I don't think that's true. What I will say is that uh, it is enormously transformative. It is incredibly powerful, and it's one thing to read about a slave cabin, and it's another thing to stand inside of one. It's another thing to hear the way the wood moans under your feet as you take a step. It's one thing to see the way that light sort of slides in through the cracks in the wood planks that sort of make up the infrastructure of the house, and to realize how susceptible to the elements these enslaved people would have been. It's one thing to read about Monticello, and it's another thing to be on that mountaintop and to see the landscape that these enslaved folks cultivated, the community they built, to walk on the same grass they would have walked on all those generations ago, the same soil, the same underbelly of earth. So, I mean, there's nothing like being at this place. And part of what I wanted to do in this book was make the reader feel like they were in these places with me. And I hope that it might serve as a catalyst, not for them to only visit these places. And I hope people will visit Monticello. I hope people visit the Whitney. I hope people visit um, Goree Island. I hope people visit so many of these places, but also to explore the sort of landscapes that surround you in your own local community, right? Like you don't have to go. I wrote this book about 8 different places, but like I could have written it about 100,008, right? The landscape of, or the scars of slavery are etched into the landscape of our country everywhere. Um, and so, you don't have to go to these places. You can kind of look around your own neighborhood, your own city, your own state, and say like, there are places here that are either telling the story or should be telling the story. And let's go check that out. But yeah, I think the experience of being physically on the land or in the space where it happened creates a different level of intimacy, which more acutely grounds us um, in an understanding of like how proximate we are to that period of time, right? That it wasn't that long ago. That if I'm standing in a slave cabin that actually held enslaved people, that this wasn't that long ago, right? Like I'd say this all the time, but the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture alongside the Obama family in 2016, she was the daughter of an enslaved person, right? Like the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter or great granddaughter, but the daughter of someone born into slavery. I was on a NPR show and they had somebody who called in, and she talked about her great grandfather, who she knew as a child, and how he was. She called him Pappy, and she was like, Pappy was born a slave, born into intergenerational chattel bondage. This is a woman who is still alive today. There are people who are still alive today who knew and loved and were raised by and were in a community with people born into slavery. And being in these places reminds you how recent that history is.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I appreciate that, yeah, like because there is a question of access. Like how many of us can get to Monticello? That depends on your time, your resources. But there are places in our communities that we can walk to that we might be living on,
Yeah.
that are holding these really important histories. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think too, like just coming from Louisiana, there's something that just be like I feel like Louisiana is haunted in ways, like not in always bad ways, but it's like being in that space. I am always reminded of that there's something that came before, and that something is very alive and present and palpable.
Mm,
But I think that that's true for many places in this country. We just need to sit still and listen, or we need to educate ourselves, or we need to pay better attention. Um,
absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. So second question, did you do all of your research before beginning writing, or did your writing lead you to new questions that required research as you wrote?
I love craft questions.
Yeah.
I did not do all my research and then write. That seems overwhelming. I know people who do that. They like do all their research, do all their traveling, all their reporting, and then they sit down and write. I that sounds I wouldn't even know what to do with that. That's just too much. What I did was I would go to a place. Um, I would experience that place. I would take a lot of notes. I would take a lot of pictures. I would do a lot of videos. I'd have a lot of conversations, and then I would come back. And the first thing that I would do was try to write the sort of scenes and the sort of sensory details, because it was fresh. And I tried to write as much of that as I could. Sometimes I would like go back to my car and I'd start writing it in the car. Um, but in the days immediately following my visit, that was the first thing I did. Then I would transcribe the interviews and figure out how the interviews sort of fit in. And oftentimes what was said on the tour or what my conversations were, or the things that I saw, those guided the research that I did. So a lot of the research didn't actually happen until after my visits to these places, because I didn't know doing research. There was a little bit of research that was done beforehand, kind of like preliminary research, but the bulk of it was done after I left these places and realized and knew what I was looking for, right? And because this book is not written by someone who began this project as an expert on the history of slavery. It's written by somebody who is a writer who wanted to learn more, and this book is my journey of learning about this history, and hopefully sharing that journey with the reader.
Yeah, that's great. That question was from Susanna. Thank you. That was a great question. The next question is from Suzanne, who asks, did you revise the book any differently than you revise your poetry collections?
Hmm. This was a very intense revision process. My editor at Little Brown, Vanessa Mobley, is amazing. And I remember when I was going in to the sort of process of selling the book, I told my agent, like, I need somebody who is gonna like look at every page, every paragraph, every line, every word, and like give me the red ink. Like, I want it. Give me this, chop it, screw it, turn it around. I want I wanted like really specific attention to every word on the page. And that Vanessa did that. I mean, she was amazing. This was obviously at the editing process. I finished my reporting in February 2020. So really it was just like 3 weeks before the pandemic shutdown started to happen. And so I feel very grateful for that, because otherwise I don't know what I would do. But Vanessa and I, over the course from, June of last year to December, sort of like did maybe 7 or 8 like 3 hour long Zoom calls, just like going over like the most minute of detail, because it mattered to me and I wanted that sort of attention. And she is such a generous but also fervent and thorough editor. And so, the way to answer that question one way is I edited the book over Zoom, which was an interesting experience. Um, but part of all with this, I think I was more concerned. My poetry collection is a narrative, but it's a sort of just disjointed coming of age narrative. Whereas I wanted this book to feel like a novel. Like, I wanted it to be a history book that read like a novel, and for someone, in which I am the protagonist, and you are alongside me on this journey of trying to better understand this country. And so I focused a lot on narrative in ways that I didn't necessarily for the poetry book, and that's probably the biggest difference.
Good question. The next one is from Catherine, who asks, can you expand on your comment that writing poetry is how you do your best thinking? How do you experience the process of thinking as you write poetry? And she is coming from the perspective of wanting to share this idea with her students.
Yeah, I think that I like poems because poetry does not necessitate that you can wrestle with the question without having to answer that question, right? Like sometimes
Mhm.
when I write an essay for the Atlantic or somewhere else, like I'm making an argument and I have to have like a conclusion and I have to have a thesis and I have to, substantiate my points. With poems, I'm kind of like, what does this mean? This is interesting. What does this mean? You're like thinking about an idea. Um, and sometimes you like realize the argument you were trying to make as you sort of think through it. But yeah, I just think that like as I write a poem, I hardly ever sit down and write a poem and I'm like, this is what the poem is going to be about. Oftentimes I have like a word or a line or a phrase or an idea that starts, and then the poem sort of grows from the middle outwards. Like a poem very rarely for me starts at the beginning and goes to the end. It's kind of this like expansion from the center outwards, and like not in an even beautiful concentric circle, in a sort of like weird amorphous shaped thing that's like Play-Doh that you're trying to like, you know, put together. So um it just allows me to play and like move things around and not feel the pressure of like, what am I trying to say? Because the exploration of the poem that happens in the poem is the most valuable thing for me.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree that poetry is so much about inquiry and about like sort of like circling an idea and not necessarily coming to any kind of conclusion like that for me is part of the beauty of being able to write it. Um, let's see. Debbie asks, what was the uh, most challenging chapter for you to write and why?
Challenging. Probably Angola. I mean, I've worked in prisons and jails for the past 7 years as a teacher, but I was completely unprepared for what I saw when I went to Angola. It's just, I mean, we talked about this in the interview, but for context, for those who don't know, Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It is 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It's a place where 75% of people held there are Black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences, and it is built on top of a former plantation. And what I tell folks is that if you were to go to Germany and you had the largest maximum security prison in Germany, built on top of a former concentration camp in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would so clearly be a global emblem of anti-Semitism, and rightfully so. It will be abhorrent. It will be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist because it would so clearly run counter to our moral and ethical sensibilities. And yet, here in the United States, we have this massive maximum security prison in the country, um, where Black men work in fields for virtually no pay while someone watches over them on horseback with a gun over their shoulder. And what does it mean that that place not only is not interested in interrogating its relationship to the history of slavery, or has not been thus far, that place has a gift shop. And in that gift shop, there are coffee mugs and shot glasses and sweatshirts and paraphernalia that say Angola, a gated community, as if to make a mockery of the experience of people who are living there. I recently just got an email from somebody who went to Angola and told me that they're changing things around at the museum. And I can't say, the person seemed convinced that it was because of the book. I can't say, I don't know. They may have been, it may be, or it may not be, but I'm glad to hear it. And I hope that they will tell a more honest story of who they are, and think about, they have a museum and they have a gift shop, and think about, to the extent that a prison should have such things, which a museum, maybe a gift shop. I don't necessarily think so. But what responsibilities come with that, and what does that look like? So Angola, I could have written a whole book about just Angola. That place was bananas, and definitely a place that continued to haunt me after I left.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a difficult chapter to read. We talked about that a little bit. Um, the penultimate question is from an anonymous person, and the question is: Your title is so beautiful and evocative. Do you think there are other equally valid ways that the word has been / can be passed? Are there any other ways to embody the truth of slavery?
Hmm. I guess the question is asking any other ways beyond uh, beyond a book, or beyond what I was trying to do with this. If that is the way the question is asked, which is a beautiful question. I wrote a book, but there are so many ways that people, scholars and journalists and artists and professionals are talking about this and putting this in front of people in ways that are really important. There are visual artists. There are there are sculptors. There are YouTubers. I mean, there's no limit to how we can more fully grapple with how the word has been passed throughout this country about this issue. And I'm someone who takes seriously what it means to meet people where they are, and that, like, as much as I would love everybody to read how the word is passed, I recognize uh, that won't happen. And so, I also host a YouTube series called Crash Course Black American History, where it's basically like a 10-minute semi-animated video about different subjects on of Black American history. And I know a lot of teachers use that, and a lot of students use that. I used it. I used it for like my world history classes. It's a great resource. And so I just I think that there are all sorts of ways to reach people. And this book is just one contribution to a really robust and incredible sort of body of work that people across all disciplines and genres and professions are doing.
Yeah, yeah, agreed, agreed. All right, last question. Edward wants to know, what's your kid's favorite knock knock joke?
What is my kid's favorite knock knock joke? I love this question. Thank you for that. So he's recently, my 2-year-old. So it's both of them kind of now. So we do like knock knock jokes for dinner time and stuff, and I'll like Google different knock knock jokes. And so they love the one that's like, knock knock, who's there? Orange, orange who? Knock knock, who's there? Orange, orange who? Knock knock, who's there? Banana, banana who? Orange, you glad I didn't say banana? And they like fall out of their chair. They love it. They think it's so funny. But it's funny because they like misunderstand the conceit of the joke, and so they don't understand the pun of orange and aren't you, aren't you? So they just think it's like you say one thing 2 or 3 times and then you say another thing, and so they'll look around the room and they'll like, knock knock, who's there? Remote, remote who? Knock knock, who's there? Remote, remote who? Knock knock, who's there? Cup, cup who? Remote, you glad I didn't say cup? Like, and they fall out of their chair and they just think it's so funny. And it's funny that that's how they understand the joke. But they're just different iterations of that. They just look around and say 2 different words. It's very funny. They're cute kids.
Yeah, oh, they sound adorable. Well, that is all. Thank you so much for having this conversation. You've given me so much to think about. Again, it's been such a joy to be able to spend time with this book. It was a wonderful read. These have been wonderful conversations. It was a lot of fun writing the profile, and yeah, so thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for this book. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you everyone so much. And if you're getting the book, please make sure you're supporting independent bookstores. They need us now more than ever. Community bookstore in New Orleans or anywhere else. But thank you all. Thank you, poets and writers. And I can't wait till we're able to do in-person events again.